In January of 2005, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game would introduce Structure Decks Dragon's Roar and Zombie Madness. What set them apart from each other and what significance do they hold in the game? There's a couple points we need to cover first. To start, there is a difference between starter decks and structure decks. Starter decks were centered around characters from the anime or around a certain time or theme. A few examples are Starter Decks Yugi and Kaiba in March of 2002, Starter Deck 2006 in March of 2006, and more throughout the game's lifetime. So what makes starter decks different than structure decks? Well, starter decks are just that. They are designed to be decks for people starting the game for the first time. Maybe there's a character you resonated with that you wanted to give their deck a shot. Or maybe you were getting into the game in a year where a starter deck was releasing. The decks were typically not very good, and that echoes well into the current game. An example of this is the 2-player starter set that was released on January 26th of this year. Many players would agree that the decks are overall awful and new players find it confusing. There are many videos about this and it is a topic for a different video, so back to structure decks. Structure decks are just as they explained, a well-structured deck. Structure decks can be hit or miss, but many of the most recent structure decks are solid and contain powerful cards that are used competitively. Some structure decks are responsible for some of the stronger strategies of Yu-Gi-Oh! One example is the Emperor of Darkness structure deck. Centered around Monarchs, this deck was so good that you could forget your deck at home, buy 3 of these, and top the event or come close to it, depending on the event and your level of play. Structure decks by design have a much more cohesive strategy built into them, and to this day are still released. So what about the first structure decks? Let's break down what sets the two decks apart from each other. Starting with Dragon's Roar, the boss monster of the deck is Red Eye's Darkness Dragon, personally one of my favorite monsters. Its effect, however, was lackluster. The idea of this deck was to turbo out dragons and summon the biggest one in the deck, Darkness Dragon, who gets even larger depending on how many dragons you have in your graveyard. The only issue was Darkness Dragon could only be special summoned by tributing a Red Eye's Black Dragon. Ideally, you would summon a Red Eye's Black Chick, use its effect to summon its daddy from your hand, and then tribute that Red Eye's for Darkness Dragon. But that relied on having 3 specific cards in your hand at once. It was pretty unreliable as a deck strategy, but I gotta admit it was still fun to try. Overall, the deck was okay, but nothing to write home about as its consistency and power was lower than the top decks of 2005 Yu-Gi-Oh's meta. Moving on to Zombie Madness, the deck's boss monster was Vampire Genesis. Like Darkness Dragon, to summon Vampire Genesis, you needed a specific monster on the field, Vampire Lord, but instead of tributing it, you would banish it instead. Getting Vampire Lord onto the field wasn't as difficult as getting Red Eyes onto the field, as there was good zombie support in the deck like Book of Life and Call of the Mummy to special summon it. The deck also had much more recursion, especially with Vampire Genesis effect to discard a zombie to summon another one with a lower level. Vampire Lord also had a pretty decent effect for early Yu-Gi-Oh! And Red Eyes is just a vanilla with no effect. Vampire Lord being able to rip a card from the deck was really good, which usually the card type chosen would be spell cards. Something to keep in mind is that the spells played in early Yu-Gi-Oh! Like Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, Raigeki, and many more were game-changing, so being able to force your opponent to send one of those to the graveyard was pretty crazy. Both decks shared similar cards in Snatch Steal, Mystical Space Typhoon, and some others, however their strategies differ greatly. Dragon's Roar is an echo to Dragon Rush, and Zombie Madness is just a straight-up control deck. So what impact did these structure decks have on the meta of 2005 Yu-Gi-Oh? Not anything at all, really. Vampire Lord would see play in some of the decks of the 2005 Shonen Jump LA Championship, including the first place slot. However, Vampire Lord debuted in Dark Crisis 2 years before the release of Zombie Madness, so it's not fair to say that Zombie Madness made that possible, as Vampire Lord is just one card from the structure deck. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing and dropping a like, as it helps me out tremendously. I upload Yu-Gi-Oh! Content just like this every Sunday, so stay tuned for more. I also live stream Monday through Friday live Let's Play series at 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Stop by sometime if you're interested in saying hi and hanging out. Until next time, duelists.